The morning of September 6, 2006, started the way all the best mornings in Clover Ridge, Ohio, do quietly. A pale gray light spreading slow and soft across the tree line on the eastern edge of town, the kind of light that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives and spreads without asking anything of the world it moves through. Crickets going still. The first bird starting up somewhere deep in the oak corridor. One voice, and then two. Then the full chorus, building from nothing to everything in the space of 10 minutes, the way the world wakes up when no one is watching. The air carrying that particular early September smell, cut grass and cooling dirt, and the faintest trace of a lake somewhere off to the east. Carried in on a light wind that moved through the yards and the open windows of sleeping houses. It was the smell of the summer releasing its grip. Not gone yet, but letting go. The kind of morning you don't know you'll remember until you're remembering it for the rest of your life. At 6:09 in the morning, on the west side of Clover Ridge, in a yellow two-story house on the corner of Maple Creek Road and Sycamore Drive, a man named Thomas Hargrove set a pot of oatmeal on the stove and turned the burner to medium. He moved quietly because his wife Linda was still asleep upstairs. He was careful with the cabinet doors. He always was, not because anyone had ever asked him to be careful with cabinet doors, but because he was the kind of man who was simply aware, in a constant and undemanding way, of the people around him and what they needed. He was careful with the coffee maker, running it on the quieter setting. He moved through his kitchen in the early morning like the way a person moves through a space they know completely, without hurrying, without wasting anything. Thomas Hargrove was 47 years old that September. He had a full head of dark hair going silver at the temples and a crooked nose from a baseball collision in 1981 that he'd never had fixed, because he always forgot about it and because it had never genuinely bothered him. He had the hands of a man who had spent 22 years working with wood, rough-palmed, scarred in small specific places, the kind of hands that know what they're doing before the mind has fully decided. He taught shop class at Clover Ridge High School. He had done so for 17 years, and in those 17 years he had developed a reputation that every teacher eventually hopes for and few fully achieve. He was the teacher students talked about as adults. Not because his class was easy or entertaining, though it was both, but because being in his class felt like being trusted, like being given something real to do, and then believed in while you did it. He never raised his voice. Not once in 17 years. Not even when Kevin Braddock in the junior class of 2003 put a drill bit through a workshop bench instead of the piece of oak he was supposed to be routing. Not even when Marcus Tyler nearly took off 2 fingers with a bandsaw because he was trying to impress a girl in the 3rd row and had stopped paying attention to the blade. In those moments, Thomas would simply walk over, look at the situation, look at the student, wait long enough that the student understood what kind of moment this was, and then say, "Okay, let's talk about what we do differently next time." And then they would. And the student would leave that conversation feeling not humiliated, but instructed, which is a specific and rare kind of grace that Thomas Hargrove made look effortless because it was, for him, entirely natural. He'd coached youth soccer for 11 seasons. He'd built the deck on their house board by board over 2 summers, always letting Danny hand him tools even when Danny was small and the help was more ceremonial than practical, because Thomas believed, without ever putting it into words, that the point of doing things together was not efficiency. It was the doing together. He knew every neighbor on their street by first name. He knew their children's names and their dogs' names, and he shoveled driveways after snowstorms without being asked and without mentioning it after. He brought in packages left on porches. He noticed when Mrs. Delgado's gutters were pulling away from her fascia and left her a note offering to take a look. 3 years before that September morning, Thomas had started a side business. Custom cabinetry and furniture, made in the workshop behind their house, sold mostly by word of mouth, grown quietly and steadily into something that had begun to feel like a real second career. He'd named it Hargrove & Son. Danny was 11 when the name went on the sign at the workshop door. He was 14 now, and still mostly handed Thomas tools without being asked what he thought, but the name was already there. The intention was already in the wood. Linda would say years later, years after everything, that Thomas fixed everything. She'd pause when she said it, The way people pause when a sentence turns out to weigh more than they expected. He fixed everything, she'd say. Even things that weren't broken. He'd see something that could be a little better, and he'd quietly make it better. I used to think that was just a thing he did around the house. But that was how he moved through the whole world. While the oatmeal cooked, Thomas walked down the hallway to the last door on the left and knocked twice, soft, with the knuckle tap he always used, the one that was somehow both a question and a command. "Hey, buddy." Up and at him. A silence, long enough to be eloquent. Then, "I'm up." He wasn't up. Thomas stood in the hallway and smiled in the dark and knocked again. "Danny, come on. Fish don't wait." A groan. The rustle of sheets. The specific quality of reluctant motion that a 14-year-old boy produces when summoned from sleep at 6 in the morning. Then the thump of feet on the floor, and a stillness that meant Danny was standing in his room, summoning the will to take the next step. Daniel Hargrove was 14 years old. He went by Danny to everyone except Coach Derricks, who called him Hargrove in that clipped and deliberately affectionate way that coaches use for the athletes they believe in most seriously. Danny was a freshman that September, first week of high school, still finding his footing in a building that was 3 times the size of the middle school. He was lean and long-limbed in the way that distance runners often are, all angles and quiet endurance, built for the long effort rather than the short burst. He had his mother's brown eyes and his father's crooked smile, and he was in that specific phase of adolescence where you haven't yet figured out how to be a teenager, but you've already stopped being a child. So you inhabit this careful middle space where you're more serious than anyone expects and funnier than you let on and absolutely certain about certain things and entirely lost about others, with no reliable way of knowing which is which. He was obsessed with weather apps. He had 3 of them on his phone. He downloaded each one after reading about its reliability in different regions and weather types, and he checked them every morning in sequence, comparing the forecasts with the seriousness of a meteorologist reviewing satellite data. He had a running comparison chart in the back section of his fish log, which app was most accurate for Clover Ridge specifically, based on 18 months of daily observation. The fish log was the other great project of Danny Hargrove's young life. A spiral-bound notebook that lived on the center of his desk, flanked by his pencil holder on one side and his cross-country medals on the other. In the fish log, he had written the name of every species of fish he intended to catch before his 18th birthday. 41 species in total. Next to each species, a hand-drawn diagram, cross-hatched and labeled with the care of someone who took the diagram seriously. Notes on habitat. Notes on preferred bait. Notes on the best seasons, the best lakes, the best times of day, the water temperature ranges in which each species was most active. He'd started the log in 6th grade. He had revised it numerous times since then, tearing out and redoing pages when his research revealed an error or when his drawings weren't accurate enough to satisfy him. 3 entries completed. Largemouth bass, caught at Millfield Pond in July 2004. Yellow perch, caught at Cotter's Lake in September 2004. Bluegill, caught at Cotter's Lake in September 2005. 3 species confirmed, documented with date and location and weight. 38 to go. He was entirely serious about getting through all of them. Jessica, who was 17 and a senior, and whose relationship with her younger brother was a symphony in the minor key of fond exasperation, would say years later that Danny made lists of lists. He had a list of the fish, a list of the lakes, a list of the best times of year, a list of the tackle for each species, a separate notebook just for weather observations, and I'm completely certain there was a master list of all the lists somewhere that he kept private because he knew I would tease him about it. He was very serious about the master list, which tells you everything you need to know about Danny as a person. She'd almost laugh when she said this. Almost. The almost was everything. That morning, September 6, 2006, was the fishing morning. The first Saturday of September fishing morning, which was not simply a plan or a tradition, but something closer to a fixed point in the calendar. The way certain things become fixed when they repeat long enough. Immovable, necessary. Theirs. Thomas and Danny had been doing this since Danny was 6 years old. 8 years of first Saturdays in September, Cotter's Lake, the southern bank, dawn until noon. The trip had started because Thomas wanted to go fishing before summer fully ended each year, and the first Saturday of September had turned out to be consistently excellent. The heat broke, the lake emptied of summer crowds. The walleye started moving in the deeper water near the southern access bank, where the trees hung close, and the light came through in angles. After 3 or 4 years, the tradition had stopped being a choice. It had become simply what the first Saturday of September was. Their morning. Nobody else's, not that either of them was possessive about it. But both of them understood without discussion that this specific ritual had grown up around just the two of them, and that what made it what it was had something to do with that. Danny came down the stairs at 6:21. Yesterday's jeans. A Clover Ridge cross-country sweatshirt with a bleach stain on the left cuff, whose origin he had never satisfactorily explained. Hair at an aggressive angle. Eyes carrying the specific, unfocused quality of a person who has been conscious for approximately 4 minutes, and is not yet sure this was a good decision. He sat at the kitchen table and examined the oatmeal with the expression of someone reviewing a contract with questionable terms. "Can we stop for hot chocolate?" he said. "Gas station kind." Thomas set a bowl in front of him. "Yeah." "The big one? With the fake whipped cream?" "Sure." Danny picked up his spoon with the air of a man making peace with his situation. "Okay, let's go." Thomas laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere easy, somewhere that isn't watching itself. He stood at the stove in the early morning kitchen with his 14-year-old son, who was negotiating with oatmeal, and he felt, without naming it, the particular quality of a morning that is good not because anything remarkable is happening, but because of the specific texture of ordinary things that you are lucky enough to have. This kitchen, this kid, this day with its fishing and its bad hot chocolate and its 38 species still to catch. Linda had packed a brown bag the night before. 2 apples, a bag of pretzels. She did it every year, set it by the back door. Thomas picked it up and added it to the cooler he'd loaded the previous evening, sandwiches, water, the candy bars that were technically for after lunch, but that Danny would begin negotiating toward by 9:30. He did a quick inventory of the tackle box by the back door. Rods were already in the truck bed. He'd loaded them after dinner, moving quietly through the backyard in the dark. At 6:34, Thomas went upstairs one last time. Linda was asleep on her side, breathing in the deep, slow rhythm of genuinely good sleep, the kind that takes the whole face with it. She'd had a hard week, a difficult conference with a parent on Wednesday, a headache that had dragged through 2 days, the accumulated fatigue of a woman who managed everything with a steadiness that made it look easier than it was. Thomas stood in the doorway and thought about waking her, about leaning down to say goodbye the way he usually did before an early departure. She was sleeping so well, so completely. He didn't want to pull her back. So instead he went to her nightstand, found the yellow sticky pad, and wrote the note. 7 words. Gone fishing. Back by noon. Love, T. He pressed it to the base of her lamp, where she'd see it when she reached over to turn it on. Then he pulled the door almost closed. Not fully, just to the point where it wouldn't latch, where the house could breathe through. On his way through the kitchen, he picked up his travel mug and his keys. Outside, Danny was in the passenger seat already, had pulled up against the September chill, head tipped back against the headrest, giving all the signs of a person prepared to fall back asleep the moment the truck started moving. Thomas put the cooler in the bed, checked the rods one more time, secured the tailgate. Jessica's room was on the 2nd floor. Her window faced the driveway. She would say later that she'd heard the truck door and rolled over and opened one eye out of some reflexive, half-conscious awareness. She saw them through the glass in the gray morning light. Danny in the passenger seat, hood up, already retreating. Thomas finishing his check of the truck bed, moving through his sequence without rushing. He looked up and saw her in the window. He raised his hand. One hand easy, unhurried. The wave of a man who will be home by noon and knows it. The wave of someone who sees you and wants you to know you're seen, with nothing more than that required. She raised her hand back. She was barely awake. She didn't know this was the last time. She didn't know she would see that raised hand in her sleep for the next 18 years, the gray light, the dark green truck, her father looking up at a window. She didn't know she was saying goodbye. Thomas Hargrove backed out of the driveway at Maple Creek Road and Sycamore Drive at 6:41 in the morning on September 6, 2006, and drove east. He and his son were never seen again. Now, before we go any further into what happened on Quarry Run Road that morning, and what was discovered at the bottom of Cotter's Lake 18 years later, and who had known the truth all along, and what 18 years of silence cost a family and a town, I need you to subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories right now. Hit that subscribe button. Ring that notification bell. Every single week on this channel, we bring you the most carefully researched, most honestly told true crime stories you will find anywhere. Stories of truth buried so deep it took decades to surface. Stories of the families who refuse to stop waiting. Stories that stay with you. This story especially, because what I am about to tell you about what happened on Quarry Run Road between 6:41 in the morning and the moment Thomas Hargrove's truck disappeared from the surface of the earth, and about the man who watched it happen, and what he chose to do, and what he chose not to do, is something you are not prepared for. Don't go anywhere. We are just getting started. Linda Hargrove woke at 8:15. She found the note at the base of her lamp, read it, touched it briefly, with one finger the way you touch something that makes you fond, set it back down, and went downstairs to make coffee. She felt good. She felt rested in a way she hadn't been in weeks, slept through the alarm rested, the deep kind that leaves you gentler with the morning. Outside the kitchen window, a squirrel was doing something entirely unnecessary and very committed in the maple tree. She stood with her coffee and watched and thought, as she sometimes did on Saturday mornings, that this arrangement, the quiet house, the good sleep, her husband and her son out doing something they loved, was one of the best configurations her life had found. By noon, she was watching the driveway. She was in the kitchen making lunch, something quiet and distracted, her eyes going to the window every few minutes, and she told herself it was fine. Thomas got absorbed at Cotter's Lake. The mornings out there had a way of compressing time, of folding 2 hours into 20 minutes when the fishing was good. She called his cell. 4 rings, voicemail. She left a message in her light voice, the voice that was warm and a little teasing and not at all worried, or not visibly worried, because she had decided not to be worried yet. She waited another 40 minutes. Called again. Voicemail again. She called Danny's phone. It rang without connecting to voicemail because Danny, in the manner of 14-year-olds across all of recorded history, had never set up his voicemail. 8 rings. 9. 10. Nothing. By 2 o'clock she was pacing. By 2:30 she had called Ray Pruitt on County Road 14, nothing, and Carl Whitfield across the street, nothing, and Thomas's mother in Columbus, who was 81 and sharp as a tack, and whose voice went immediately quiet in the specific way of mothers who have learned to be afraid. Linda said she didn't know where they were. She heard Thomas's mother breathe in. She said she was sure it was fine. Neither of them believed it. By 3 o'clock she got in her car and drove to Cotter's Lake herself. 14 miles on Route 9 with her hands tight on the wheel and her eyes moving to every shoulder and turnout and side road between Clover Ridge and the lake, cataloging the absence of anything wrong with a kind of focused desperation, as if not finding disaster would amount to finding them. The road was clear. The afternoon was golden. There was nothing wrong with any of it except that there was no dark green F-150 anywhere on it. She turned onto the lake access road. She drove to the southern bank. The lake was flat and gray-green and entirely indifferent. The picnic table. The rusted bench. A blue heron at the water's edge. No truck. No Thomas. No Danny. She got out and stood at the bank and looked at the water. The heron watched her with its ancient, unreadable eyes, and then flew slowly away. She stood there long enough to be certain that what she was looking at was truly an absence, and not something she was missing. And then she drove home and called the Clover Ridge Police Department, and, for the first time, the light voice was not entirely available to her. By nightfall, half of Clover Ridge had come out. The high school gymnasium was open. Thomas's photograph was on the whiteboard. His soccer kids, now teenagers, were in the search groups. Danny's middle school friends were out with their parents on the road shoulders with flashlights. The lake was dragged overnight. Dive teams went in at dawn. A helicopter flew grid patterns. The state patrol alerted statewide. Every gas station and convenience store on Route 9 was canvassed. Traffic camera footage reviewed. Credit card records checked. Nothing since September 5th. Phone records showed both phones pinging a cell tower on Route 9 approximately 8 miles east of Clover Ridge at 7:04 in the morning. After that, silence. Both phones dark. A truck and two people had simply stopped existing somewhere between that tower and the lake. Detective Raymond Okafor caught the case on September 7th. Ray was 43, a 17-year veteran of the Clover Ridge PD, with the last 6 years as detective. He was methodical and steady and not easily spooked by cases that didn't resolve cleanly. But this one unsettled him in a specific way from the beginning, not because of its complexity, but because of its completeness. Everything was wrong with a case that should have had something to grab onto. A car on a familiar road in daylight. No financial irregularities. No documented conflicts. No passport used, no credit card touched, no evidence of premeditation in any direction. Just a man and his son who drove east on Route 9 and stopped existing. Ray also knew Thomas Hargrove. He had grown up 2 streets over, had sat behind him in chemistry junior year at Clover Ridge High, had played pickup basketball with him at the rec center for 2 years in their late 20s before Ray's right knee started filing formal complaints. They weren't friends who saw each other regularly. Those friendships require maintenance that busy lives don't always allow, but they were something older and quieter than that. 2 men from the same place, built partly by the same specific gravity of a specific small town, carrying some of the same reference points. Ray put Thomas's faculty photograph on the wall of his workspace. He kept it there for 12 years. He told himself it was to keep the case human. That was true. It was also because Thomas's steady, patient face was a reminder of what the work was for. He went to see Linda on September 8th. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Thomas had made oatmeal 2 days before, and he asked the questions that the job required him to ask. Were there financial problems? Debt? Gambling? Any indication of a secret life? Any recent change in behavior? Any reason at all, that Thomas might have wanted to disappear? Linda answered every question calmly and directly. No. The side business was doing well. Thomas had been talking seriously about leaving teaching to run it full-time. The marriage was not in difficulty. Thomas was happy. He had been excited about the fishing trip for 2 weeks. Danny had been working on his fish log the night before, adding notes to the walleye entry, preparing. Thomas had filled the truck's gas tank on the afternoon of September 5th, checked the oil, made sure the cooler was stocked. He was looking forward to it in the way that a man looks forward to the thing that gives him the most uncomplicated joy in his life. Ray believed her. He'd already checked the finances. Everything she said was true. He drove Route 9 11 times in the first month. He walked every shoulder. He got down on his hands and knees at 3 different turnouts, looking for tire marks, disturbed gravel, anything. He brought in a tracker with bloodhounds. The dogs took the scent from Danny's cross-country jersey and Thomas's work jacket and followed it to the front curb of the house on Maple Creek Road and stopped. Heads down, confused. The trail ended in the road, where the truck had been parked, as if they had simply risen from it and evaporated. By October, the leads were thin. By November, they were nearly gone. By the first snow, there was nothing left to chase that hadn't already been chased to nothing. The file grew thicker. The answers did not appear. Linda Hargrove spent that first winter suspended. That's the word she would use years later. Not grieving, because grief requires a known loss, a moment you can mark, something definitive to mourn. Not hoping, exactly, because hope had gone transparent under the weight of time. Suspended, paying close attention all the time to everything, in case what she needed to see arrived. She paid Thomas's phone bill every month. She paid Danny's as well. She unlocked the workshop sometimes and stood in the smell of it, sawdust, linseed oil, the specific resin of the maple planks Thomas had been working with, and stood there without touching anything, and then locked it again. Danny's room she did not touch. The fish log on his desk. The cross-country shoes by the door. The medals on the shelf in whatever order Danny had put them in, which was not chronological or size-based, and was some other logic that Jessica claimed to understand and probably didn't. The room was exactly the room it had been on the morning of September 6th. She did not change it because she could not make herself believe, all the way down, that Danny was not coming back to it. The yellow note stayed under her coffee mug for 6 months. That was where Thomas had put it, tucked under an object, so it wouldn't blow away when she opened the back door, the way he sometimes did with notes for her. She could not pick it up. It felt like if she picked it up she was doing something to the morning it came from, collapsing some protected space. After 6 months, she finally lifted the mug, took the note, put it in an envelope, put the envelope in the nightstand drawer. That was as far as she could go. Jessica went back to school in October. Linda made her go, because the alternative, both of them held still in the house, waiting together, breathing the same suspended air, was a slower kind of damage. Jessica went, and she was different in a way that all her teachers noticed, and none of them quite knew how to address. More careful, more quiet, older around the eyes. She ran cross-country that fall because Danny had been planning to run cross-country, and it was something to do with the feeling of his absence. Put in the legs, put it in the forward motion. Coach Derrick's retired Danny's locker at the end of that season. Number 145. A brass plate, Danny's name and year, screwed to the door. If you went to Clover Ridge High today and walked the athletics corridor, you would still find it. The plate has some tarnish now, but the engraving is clear. Daniel Hargrove, class of 2010. He would have graduated in 2010. He would have been 22 years old this year if this were still that world. The years passed in the way that years pass in small towns, through seasons and games and graduations, through the slow replacement of the familiar with the new, through the retirement of people who remembered, and the growth of people who would only ever know the story secondhand. Thomas's soccer kids graduated, went to college, came back for Thanksgiving, left again for good. The team he'd coached for 3 seasons won the county championship in 2008, and the parents who'd stood in that parking lot with coffee afterward talked about Thomas the way people talk about a coach who made them better, which is the best and most accurate way to talk about a person. His name was woven into the texture of the town. Mentioned. Present. Then allowing itself to settle back into the silence around it. Jessica graduated in June of 2009. Linda sat in the 3rd row of the bleachers with 2 empty seats beside her. She had deliberately not asked anyone to sit in them. The empty seats were the truth, and she was not going to put something untrue where the truth was. Jessica married Andrew Webb in September of 2011. She'd chosen the date before she realized the anniversary, and when she realized it, she kept it. She decided that September had to be allowed to be more than one thing, had to be allowed to hold a beginning as well as an absence. The wedding program listed her family members by name. Linda, Thomas, Jessica, Danny. Present tense. No qualifiers. They had never been declared dead. They were absent. Jessica did not know how to write the word late in front of her father's name, and so she did not. Andrew was steady and decent and had listened to the full story on their 3rd date without flinching or trying to fix it or offering interpretations, which was when Jessica understood he was someone she could be with. He understood, without being told, that he was marrying into a missing as well as a family, and that both would need to be tended, and he was willing. Linda's first grandchild, Rachel, was born in July of 2013. Linda held her in the delivery room and cried in the specific way that is both grief and joy simultaneously, not mixed, not blended, but fully both at once, each complete in itself, occupying the same space at the same time. Thomas would have been a magnificent grandfather. She knew this with the precision of someone who had watched him with children for 17 years. The knowledge sat beside the joy of Rachel's weight in her arms and did not lessen either thing. She had learned by then, through the long curriculum of the years, that grief and joy were going to travel together from here on, and that fighting the arrangement was a waste of what she needed for everything else. In 2015, Jessica had a son. She named him Thomas Daniel Hargrove Webb. He went by Tommy immediately and without discussion. He had, by whatever specific generosity of genetics, his grandfather's eyes. That particular quality, steady, attentive, present, in an infant face. Linda noticed it when Tommy was about 4 months old and had to leave the room. Ray Okafor worked the case for 12 years alongside everything else his career required of him. He drove Route 9 more times than he could count. He sent the case file to 4 different state and federal agencies. He consulted with forensic investigators twice at Ohio State. He followed every tip that came in through the national databases and the local tip line, including the credible ones and the not credible ones, and the ones that were clearly coming from people who were trying to help but had nothing specific. In 12 years, he had logged more than 400 documented hours on the Hargrove file, in addition to all the hours that didn't make it into logs. He retired in spring of 2018. On his last day at the station, he took Thomas's photograph off the wall, put it in a manila envelope, and carried it to his car. He drove home to his house on Birchwood Drive and set the photograph on the mantelpiece. He told his wife Deborah that this was the one he would carry. She told him she already knew. The file went to Sandra Booker, who was 44 and thorough and had grown up in Clover Ridge, had been a teenager when the Hargroves disappeared, had been in that gymnasium with a map in her hands, not fully understanding the weight of what she was participating in. She went through the file completely fresh, reviewed every interview, followed up every lead that wasn't fully closed. She found no new angles. She followed 4 older threads to their ends. Nothing. The tip line received a handful of calls per year. The file collected its weight. Clover Ridge changed. New housing, new faces, new restaurants where the diners hadn't grown up hearing the story. To the newer residents, it was a local legend. The way old tragedies become legends when the people who remember them personally begin to leave. A story you heard. A thing that happened. But Linda Hargrove drove to Cotter's Lake every Saturday morning. She had been doing it since the first month, since before she even fully understood why she was doing it, compelled by something that didn't require justification. They were on their way to that lake, and this was the place they were headed, and she was going to keep showing up at the place they were headed. The same way you keep a commitment to someone you're meeting even when they don't arrive, because stopping feels like the wrong thing, because stopping means something she is not ready to have mean. She sat in the car and looked at the water through the windshield. Coffee from a thermos. 20 minutes, sometimes 30. Every Saturday for 18 years. She missed 9 Saturdays total illness, and the Saturday after Rachel was born complicated and Jessica was in the hospital for 3 days. 9 Saturdays out of 936. She kept the count in the back of the same date book she'd kept since 2001. She would say, when people asked, "I don't know exactly what I'm doing there. I just know that they were on their way to that lake. This is where they were going. It feels like I should be here, meeting them. I've been meeting them for a long time." In the spring of 2024, the Ridgeline County Water Authority announced a major infrastructure project, expansion and upgrade of the Cotter's Lake Dam system, improved water intake capacity for the county's eastern communities, funded in part by federal infrastructure dollars that had been sought for several years and had finally arrived. A part of the project scope required a full underwater survey of the lake floor near the dam and along the southern bank. Sedimentation mapping, structural assessment, baseline data before ground disturbance began. The survey contract went to a Columbus company called Deepmark Surveying. Their lead diver was Marcus Webb, 39 years old, former Navy diver, 11 years of commercial survey work after his service. Marcus had seen a great deal on the floors of lakes and rivers, sunken equipment, vehicles, the ordinary and extraordinary debris that bodies of water accumulate over decades. He processed the unusual with the steady methodology of someone who had been trained never to project onto a situation before he had enough information to know what it actually was. Deepmark began work at Cotter's Lake on April 14, 2024. Marcus and his 2-person crew launched from the southern bank at first light, beginning their systematic grid sweeps in the shallows and moving toward depth. The visibility dropped sharply below 6 meters. At 9 meters, it was dark and close, heavy with accumulated silt that had been settling for decades, soft, deep layers that billowed slowly at any disturbance. At 9:22 in the morning, the side-scan sonar, returned a reading that made Marcus tell his surface operator to mark the GPS coordinates and flag the position. There was something on the floor at approximately 9 meters depth, large, angular, partially buried, with a profile that did not match any natural formation. Approximately 5 meters long and 2 meters wide. Metal. Heavy. Marcus dove. He descended through the green-gray water column, through the drop in visibility, through the slowly billowing silt cloud. He reached the floor and moved forward with his light cutting through the murk. And then there, a shape resolving, a flat surface, a line of glass cracked and thick with algae. He put his gloved hand on it. Automotive. He moved slowly along the vehicle's side. A mirror, bent but present. The door seam. He followed the body toward the rear. He reached the back bumper and swept his hand across it in one long, slow motion, clearing the accumulated silt. An Ohio license plate. He could see the arrangement of characters through the algae, but not read them clearly. He committed the pattern and position to memory. He surfaced. He sat on the survey boat for a moment. His assistant Kelly Park knew the quality of this particular stillness. Full-size pickup, Marcus said. Been down there a long time. He called 911 at 9:31. He was calm and specific and gave GPS coordinates to the meter. The first cruiser arrived at the southern bank by 9:51. By 10:30, there were 6 official vehicles at the scene. By noon, news crews had found the access road. The State Patrol's dive team identified the vehicle and read the plate number at 11:47. The dispatcher who received that plate number in the radio traffic recognized it. She'd been on overnight dispatch the week the Hargroves disappeared. She was one of 3 people still at the department from that original shift, and she flagged it immediately and called her lieutenant. The lieutenant called Sandra Booker. Sandra Booker was at her desk reading an unrelated forensic report, and her phone rang, and Sandra Booker's career in law enforcement divided itself into before and after in the space of one phone call. Now stop for a moment, because I need you to understand what this means. What Marcus Webb found at the bottom of Cotter's Lake, 9 meters down, buried under almost 2 decades of silt, was not simply a vehicle. It was the answer to 18 years of questions. It was 18 years of Linda Hargrove's Saturday mornings. It was the explanation for a yellow note in a nightstand drawer, for a brass plate on a locker, for a fish log with 3 completed entries sitting untouched on a 14-year-old's desk. The answer had been 14 miles from Maple Creek Road the entire time. And here is what that answer contained. Here is the part that stops everyone who hears it. Because the story of why Thomas and Danny Hargrove were at the bottom of that lake, and who knew about it, and what they chose to do, and what they chose not to do, is about to completely change everything you thought you understood about this case. The recovery operation took 9 hours. They secured the vehicle to the lifting harness in stages, working carefully around the sedimentation, treating the site like the evidence scene it was. At 4:38 in the afternoon, 18 years and 4 months after Thomas Hargrove backed out of the driveway on Maple Creek Road, the dark green F-150 broke the surface of Cotter's Lake. The paint was mostly intact beneath the algae. The windshield was cracked but present. The truck bed still held, under silt and debris, the decomposed remnants of a tackle box, fishing rods, a canvas bag. 2 apples, somehow still identifiable, reduced to almost nothing. The passenger side front quarter panel showed a deep impact dent, metal bent hard backward, consistent with a major lateral collision. The front doors were intact. Both windows were intact, still rolled up. Dr. Paula Whitmore, the Ridgeline County Medical Examiner, confirmed what the recovery team had found. 2 sets of human remains. Adult male, driver's position, seatbelt engaged. Juvenile male, passenger position, seatbelt engaged. In the driver's left hip pocket, a leather wallet containing a Clover Ridge High School faculty ID. Thomas Hargrove. Shop department. In the passenger's sweatshirt pocket, a student ID. Clover Ridge High School. Daniel Hargrove. Class of 2010. They had been there. They had been there the whole time. In the water they were on their way to. 14 miles from home. Dr. Whitmore's determination was drowning. Both men had drowned. No injuries sustained before entry to the water. They were alive when the truck went in. The windows were rolled up. The doors were jammed shut by the impact forces and the pressure of the water. There was no way out. Thomas's hand on the steering wheel. Danny's hands against the dashboard. The position of someone bracing, someone conscious and present, someone who felt what was happening and could not stop it. The accident reconstruction was completed over 72 hours. The State Patrol's investigators determined Thomas had turned onto Quarry Run Road from Route 9, taking the older route to the Southern Lake access, the route he knew and preferred. At a point approximately 80 meters from the bank, on a narrow section of road where the surface ran directly above the lake's southern bank, elevated 3 meters above the water with no guardrail, the passenger side of the F-150 sustained a major impact from another vehicle. Paint transfer on the truck's door and quarter panel was dark metallic blue. Automotive paint, early 2000s vintage. The impact pushed the truck sideways at speed and over the edge. Into the water. Nose down. 90 seconds to the bottom, where the heavy silt covered it rapidly and completely, and where it would remain sealed and hidden and holding everything for 18 years. Someone had hit that truck on Quarry Run Road. Someone had hit it and the truck had gone into the lake. And for 18 years, that someone had said nothing. And Sandra Booker was reading the preliminary report on the morning of April 17th when the phone on her desk rang and the voice on the other end was elderly and trembling and said, "I need to tell you about what happened on that road." Gerald Purcell was 70 years old. He lived in a small house in Milford Township, 12 miles from Clover Ridge, in a neighborhood where the houses were set far back from the road and the yards ran to a cultivated orderliness that felt like effort rather than ease. He opened the door before Sandra knocked. He had been watching for her car. He told her he had been sober for 14 years. He wanted that on the record first. Not as mitigation, he was insistent about this, explicitly insistent, several times, but because he wanted her to understand the difference between the person who made the choices he made in 2006 and the person standing in this doorway. Getting sober didn't undo what he'd done. Nothing undid it. But it meant that for 14 years he had been living in what he'd done clearly, without the cushion, without the blur. He wanted her to know that the seeing of it had been complete and uninterrupted for 14 years. He did not say this to ask for credit. He said it to give her a picture of what these years had been. They sat at his kitchen table. She set the recorder between them. She read him his rights. He waived counsel. She asked why. He said he had had 18 years to decide that he didn't want a lawyer between him and what he had to say. He had been drinking the morning of September 6, 2006. He had lost his job at the Whitmore Lumber Yard the week before. 9 years of employment terminated for what they called performance issues, which was the corporate language for he was drinking on company time and everyone knew it, and he had refused to acknowledge it. His wife, Carol, had issued an ultimatum the same week. He had not believed she would follow through. She did. He was driving because sitting still in the house was worse than moving, and he had nowhere specific to go. He turned onto Quarry Run Road. He'd driven it before. A pretty road in September. He was going approximately 50 miles an hour on a road posted at 35. He was in the center of the lane, which was what he did when he'd been drinking and wasn't fully aware he was doing it. He came around the curve, and there was the dark green truck coming the other way. He swerved right, toward the lakeside. His vehicle made contact with the passenger side of the truck at significant speed. He heard it and felt it and watched the truck go sideways and over the edge. Into the water. Nose first. Gone in 90 seconds. He got out of his car. He walked to the edge. He stood there for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and he looked at the flat, settling water. And he made a calculation. The calculation was, if I call 911 and stay, I will be arrested and my life will be over. The calculation was also, they might be able to get out. Someone might come along and see. He said these things knowing, he admitted, that he did not actually believe them. He said he knew the difference between a belief and a thing you tell yourself to justify what you're already going to do. He said the honest word for what he did in those 4.5 minutes was not calculation. The honest word was cowardice. He got back in his car. He drove home. He told Carol he'd hit a deer. She left 2 weeks later, took their daughter, went to her mother's. He was alone in the house on the evening of September 7th when the first news reports ran. He watched them. He watched Linda Hargrove's face on his television screen. He watched the search parties. He watched all of it for months, and he said nothing. He drank for 5 more years after that. Then he got sober. He moved to Milford Township. He got a job doing property maintenance for a small management company, work that required no credentials and no explanation, and that he could do quietly and alone. He did not attend church. He did not join anything. He did not make friends in any real sense. He made small repairs and kept his house tidy and watched the news on Saturday evenings and got up on Sunday mornings and did it again. He had thought about suicide, he told Sandra, not as a plan, but as a constant background awareness, a door he knew was there and had decided not to open, mostly because ending it felt like another form of cowardice, another way of not having to face the thing he'd done. He chose to stay and face it. 14 years of facing it clearly. 14 years of knowing that every morning was the consequence of a calculation made at the edge of a lake bank. When the news reported the discovery of the truck, he sat in his chair and watched. He watched the crane. He watched the dark green F-150 break the surface. He sat there for 3 days before he called. "Why now?" Sandra asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because they found them," he said. "Because the family deserves to know exactly what happened, and they almost know, and I'm the only one who has the rest of it. And because I am 70 years old, and I have a bad heart, and whatever time I have left I do not want to spend standing at that bank. I'm tired of standing at that bank. I want to answer for it. I want Linda Hargrove to know what happened to her family. I think she has earned that. I think she has earned every word of it." He slid the letter across the table. Sandra Booker arrested Gerald Purcell in his kitchen on the morning of April 17, 2024. He did not resist. He did not ask for anything. He stood and offered his wrists. They walked out through his front hallway into the April morning and into the rest of what there was to face. Ray Okafor drove 3 hours to Clover Ridge that afternoon. He went to Linda's house on Maple Creek Road, and she opened the door before he knocked. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and had no words sufficient to the moment. So he said her name. She said his. She stepped back and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, Ray and Linda and Jessica, and Ray told them what Sandra had told him. Every detail, because Linda asked for every detail, because she had been waiting 18 years for every detail, and she was owed them, and she was going to have them. He told her about Quarry Run Road, about the paint transfer and the impact and the 90 seconds. He told her what the reconstruction indicated about Thomas's position and Danny's position in the final moments. He told her about the 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He told her all of it. When he finished, Linda was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, were they facing each other? At the end, Ray told her yes, as best the forensics could determine. Yes. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears on her face and an expression that Ray spent years afterward trying to find a single word for. Not peace, too easy. Not forgiveness, too simple. Not closure, which is a word that people use who haven't sat where Linda Hargrove was sitting. Something older and harder and more specifically earned than any of those words. The expression of a woman who has carried something for 18 years and has finally been given the thing that allows her to set it down, not to forget it, not to be free of it, but to finally know what it actually was. To grieve, at last the actual thing. Sandra Booker brought the letter the following week. Linda read it at the kitchen table. She read it once. She folded it back, put it in the envelope, drove to Cotter's Lake, walked, for the first time in 18 years, all the way to the edge of the bank and pushed the envelope into the water. She didn't burn it. She didn't keep it. She gave it to the lake. The lake had kept everything else. It could keep this too. Gerald Purcell stood trial in August of 2024, entered his guilty plea, and was sentenced in October by Judge Margaret Adler, who gave him the maximum the law provided for the age of the offense and the specific facts. 12 years for the vehicular homicides, for years for failure to render aid concurrent. A life sentence at 70 with a cardiac history that was already advanced. At sentencing, Linda Hargrove spoke for 4 minutes and 38 seconds, the same duration, though she hadn't measured it or planned it, as the time Gerald Purcell had spent at the bank of Cotter's Lake on September 6, 2006. She told the court she wasn't there to explain what had been taken from her. She said that was not Gerald to understand. She said she was there to put it on record that it was real, and it was hers, and he had taken it. She told him about Tommy, 9 years old, his grandfather's eyes. Never met the man whose eyes he had. She told Gerald she wanted him to sit with that for whatever time he had left. She stepped down. She did not look at him again. Gerald Purcell died in the Ridgeline County Correctional Facility on March 2, 2025, 5 months into his sentence. Cardiac arrest. He was 70 years old. When Sandra Booker called Linda with the news, Linda sat at her kitchen table with it for a while. Then she called Jessica. "How do you feel?" Jessica asked. A long silence. "Like a door closed in another room," Linda said. "Just quiet." "Are you okay?" "I think so," Linda said. "I think I'm going to be." The funeral for Thomas and Danny Hargrove was held on May 17, 2024. First Methodist on Main Street, where the Hargroves had attended for 17 years. The church held 400. People stood on the steps and the lawn and down the sidewalk half a block. Thomas's soccer players, now in their late 30s and early 40s with their own children, stood along the left side of the sanctuary. Danny's cross-country teammates, men and women now in their mid-30s, sat together in the center rows. Ray and Deborah Okafor near the back, because Ray felt he didn't deserve a front seat, and nobody who knew Ray would have agreed with that assessment. Sandra Booker near the front at Linda's invitation. The caskets were closed. In Thomas's casket, his faculty ID card returned by the medical examiner. The yellow note in its envelope, gone fishing back by noon, which had been in the nightstand drawer for 18 years. And the wedding ring Linda had worn on a chain at her throat since the investigators had given it to her with the recovered effects. The ring she had touched every day for 18 years until it had worn a faint mark on the skin above her collarbone. In Danny's casket, the fish log. 3 entries complete. 38 to go. She had kept it on his desk for 18 years, exactly where he left it. She put it back in his hands. Patrick Greer, 41 years old, former student of Thomas Hargrove's, now running his own construction company with 4 children and a reputation in the county for doing excellent work with a kind of unhurried thoroughness that everyone who worked with him recognized as something he'd learned somewhere specific. Patrick Greer stood at the podium and said that Thomas Hargrove had taught him more about what a man should be than anyone else he had ever encountered. He had to stop twice. He finished. Coach Derricks spoke about Danny, about a young man who ran like he was looking for something, about his certainty that Danny would have found it, about how the locker number would stay for as long as that corridor existed. Tommy, 9 years old, Thomas Daniel Hargrove, his grandfather's steady eyes in his young face, held his grandmother's hand through the entire service without fidgeting, without asking to leave, in the way children sometimes step into seriousness when seriousness needs them. In the parking lot afterward, he asked his grandmother if the fishing was really good at Cotter's Lake. Linda looked at his face. "Best fishing in Ohio," she said. "Can we go sometime?" She looked at him for a long moment, his grandfather looking back at her from behind this child's eyes. "Yeah," she said. "We can go." Linda Hargrove still drives to Cotter's Lake on Saturday mornings, but she walks to the edge now. She stands at the water. She brings 2 cups of coffee from the gas station on Route 9, the big ones with the fake whipped cream, Danny's order, which she started getting as an act of remembrance and continued because she discovered, somewhere in the first year of doing it, that she actually liked them. She drinks hers slowly. She sets Danny's cup on the bank at the water's edge and lets the lake do with it what the lake wants. Last October, she brought Tommy. He was 10 by then. He came with a new spiral-bound notebook, his name on the inside cover in his careful printing, and he asked his grandmother what kinds of fish you could catch at Cotter's Lake in October. She told him walleye, largemouth bass, sometimes catfish if you were patient enough, and the light was low. He wrote it down. He drew a small diagram of each species in the margin. He made a list. 3 entries. 38 to go. Thomas and Danny Hargrove left Maple Creek Road on a September morning with oatmeal in their stomachs and hot chocolate plans and a fish log in progress, and nowhere to be except exactly where they were going, which was 14 miles east on Route 9, which was Cotter's Lake, which was the specific, uncomplicated joy of a father and his son with a whole morning ahead of them. They were taken from that morning not by fate, not by weather, not by some force beyond anyone's accounting for. They were taken by a man who drove drunk on a narrow road, and by 4.5 minutes in which that man decided that his fear was worth more than 2 lives, and then carried that decision for 18 years in a small house in Milford Township, while the rest of the world went on. That is the shape of it. That is what those 4.5 minutes cost. But here's also what is true. Linda Hargrove showed up at that lake every Saturday for 18 years. Jessica kept her father's name in the wedding program and on her son's birth certificate. Coach Derek's screwed a brass plate to a locker and kept it there. A grandson was named for the grandfather he never met. A wedding ring wore a mark on a woman's collarbone for 18 years. A note stayed in a nightstand drawer. A fish log stayed on a desk. None of these are small things. Every single one of them is a choice. Every single one of them is a person saying, out loud or silently, or both, you are still here. You still count. I am still bringing your name into the world. Truth does not always surface quickly. Sometimes it takes 18 years and a sonar reading at 9 meters and a man at 70 who finally cannot carry his silence into whatever comes next. But it surfaces. It is always still there. The lake held its secret for 18 years. But the lake could not hold it forever. The silt settled and the years accumulated and the water went dark and cold and still. But the truck was there. The truth was there. It had always been there, waiting for the morning when someone's instrument would finally find it. Thomas Hargrove, Daniel Hargrove, a father and a son who went fishing on a September morning and were on their way to the water and were found there in the end, where they had always been heading. May they rest in the peace that was waiting for them at the lake they loved. May their family feel, in some small portion of the very large portion they deserve, that this long road came to something, that the showing up mattered, that it always mattered. The weeks after the discovery, before the arrest, in the strange suspended period when the truck had been found and identified and the forensics were still being assembled, were among the most difficult Linda Hargrove said she had experienced since the first winter. Not because anything was uncertain, not because the answers were in doubt, but because knowing was its own kind of work. For 18 years, she had been waiting to know. Now she knew some of it. She knew they were in the lake. She knew they had been there all along. She knew the truck had been struck by another vehicle. And the knowing was real and substantial, and it was also unexpectedly its own weight. Grief that has been held in a state of suspension requires a kind of dismantling when the suspension ends. You have to let it be what it actually is. Linda had not allowed herself to fully believe, in the deepest part of herself, that Thomas and Danny were dead. She had known it statistically, logically, in the rational mind that processes probabilities. But in some room further back, some room she had protected very carefully for 18 years, she had kept a different knowledge. That they might come home. That there might be an explanation. That the morning of September 6th might have a story that ended differently than the evidence suggested. That room was closed now. It had to be closed. And closing it was work. She called Barbara Eastwood every day in those 2 weeks. Barbara came and sat with her on 4 different evenings, sometimes talking and sometimes not talking. Once just sitting in Linda's kitchen watching the cooking competition show that Linda had never cared about and Barbara watched every week, and that turned out to be, in that specific context, exactly the right thing. Linda laughed twice at things the competitors said. Barbara noted this carefully without mentioning it. Later she told Jessica that the laughing was important. That laughing in those 2 weeks meant Linda's body still knew the way back to itself. Jessica already knew. She'd been watching her mother for 18 years with the particular attention of a daughter who understood that her mother's well-being was partly hers to tend, and who had learned to read the signs, the laughter, the appetite, the quality of the voice on the phone, the way a navigator reads instruments. There were students of Thomas Hargrove's who found out about the discovery on social media before the news had officially reported it. The Clover Ridge High School Alumni Facebook group, 1,200 members, mostly graduates from the 1990s and 2000s, lit up on the afternoon of April 14th with reposts of the local news alert, and then with something else, memory. People who had been in Thomas Hargrove's shop class 20 years ago found themselves typing things they hadn't thought about in years. The thing about the drill press in junior year. The thing about the sanding technique he'd shown 3 different times until it stuck. The note he'd written on a project, not a grade, a note that said you have a real feeling for wood. The way he'd said, without drama, after the bandsaw incident, everyone has a moment when they stop paying attention. The skill is understanding what that moment costs. A man named Kevin Braddock, who was now 37 and lived in Columbus and managed a custom furniture workshop that made pieces he sold to interior designers across the Midwest, posted, "I put a drill bit through a workbench in Mr. Hargrove's class when I was 16. He walked over, looked at the bench, looked at me, waited. Then he said, 'Let's talk about what we do differently next time.' I've been using that sentence with my own employees for 10 years. It's the best management advice I ever got, and it came from a shop teacher who was patient with a kid who didn't deserve it. Rest in peace, Mr. H." The post received 412 likes. The thread ran to 214 comments over 3 days. Sandra Booker read the thread in its entirety on the evening of April 16th, sitting at her desk after everyone else had gone home. She printed the first page of it and put it in the case file. It seemed like something that should be there. Danny Hargrove would have been 32 years old in 2024. The fish log had been started when he was 12. If you do the arithmetic, and people in Clover Ridge, in the weeks and months after the discovery, found themselves doing this arithmetic in quiet moments, the arithmetic of the unlived years. Danny would have been 21 when Tommy was born. He would have been an uncle. He would have been 32 when the truck was found, old enough to have been through his own version of the years in between, whatever those years would have contained. There's no knowing, of course. There's only the arithmetic and the image of a 14-year-old with a fish log and a weather app and 38 species still to catch, and the particular kind of forward momentum that belonged to him. The steady, methodical, list-making, species-identifying momentum of a person who was going to keep going until he'd gotten through all 41. Jessica thought about this sometimes. She thought about it when Tommy asked his first question about fish, when Tommy started keeping his own notebook, when she saw the same quality in her son's face that she had watched in her brother's, the seriousness, the pleasure in categorizing things, the small private satisfaction of adding a new entry. She didn't say anything to Tommy about the parallel. She thought she might tell him someday. She thought he'd understand it when he was older. The way that the things we inherit from people we've never met can be the truest inheritances, the ones that skip the conscious and go straight to the bone. Linda kept the fish log on Danny's desk for 18 years and then put it in his hands and closed the casket and walked out into the May afternoon and the rest of her life. She keeps the desk now. She kept the room for a long time after the funeral before she finally, slowly, let it change. She didn't empty it all at once. She moved things in stages, the way you do something you've been postponing, a little at a time, with rests in between, with full permission to stop and go back. The basketball posters came down first. Then the medals, which went into the shoebox in the closet alongside the other things she was keeping. The desk stayed. The desk is still in that room. It is empty now except for a lamp and one photograph. Danny at the lake, September 2005. Holding up a yellow perch with both hands and grinning in the way that 14-year-olds grin when they have just added an entry to their fish log. Entry number 2. 39 to go. The Ridgeline County Water Authority issued a statement in June of 2024 saying that the Cotter's Lake Infrastructure Project would proceed as planned, with the addition of a 30-day delay to allow the investigation and recovery to complete fully and with appropriate care for the site. When the project eventually resumed, when Deepmark returned with their equipment, when the survey was finished and the construction phase began, there was a discussion, briefly, about whether the project should continue at all, whether the place that had held Thomas and Danny Hargrove for 18 years should be turned into something else. Linda Hargrove, when asked her opinion by a reporter from the Clover Ridge Gazette, said that she thought it should proceed. She said the lake was not the problem. The lake had been a good lake before September 6, 2006, and it had been the place her family was heading toward on the best morning of any given year, and what had happened at the lake was not the lake's fault. She said she hoped the project made the water better and that people used it well. She said her family had. She said her grandson intended to. The new dam expansion was completed in November 2024, 7 months after Marcus Webb's sonar reading. The water systems serving the eastern county were upgraded on schedule. The southern bank where Thomas and Linda and Danny had fished every first Saturday of September, where Linda had parked and looked at the water every Saturday for 18 years, was not significantly altered by the construction. The bank remained. The gravel remained. The picnic table was replaced by the County Parks Commission with a newer one, cedar, with a small plaque. The plaque reads, "In memory of Thomas and Daniel Hargrove of Clover Ridge, who loved this lake. May all who fish here cast their lines with joy." It was put there by the county commissioner, a woman named Alice Pemberton, who had been on Thomas's soccer coaching staff for 2 seasons in the late 1990s and who had thought about him, by her own account, on approximately every first Saturday of September since he disappeared. She had proposed a plaque and paid for it personally and installed it herself on a November morning before the cold came in, with her husband holding a level and her daughter handing her the hardware. She didn't tell anyone she was doing it. She sent a photograph to Linda after it was done. Linda kept the photograph on the refrigerator. She printed a copy for Tommy. He read it. He asked her to take him to see it in person. She took him in December, a gray cold Saturday, with the lake the color of pewter and the trees bare and the whole landscape stripped down to its essentials. They stood at the bank and they read the plaque together. Tommy traced the letters of his grandfather's name with one finger. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked they could come back when it was warmer and bring the fishing rods. Linda said yes. Detective Sandra Booker would say, in the years following the closure of the Hargrove case, that the investigation taught her something about the nature of evidence that she had known theoretically, but had not fully understood until this case made it visceral. The thing she learned was this: evidence doesn't age out of relevance. A paint transfer on a door panel after 18 years underwater is still a paint transfer. A vehicle registration in a repair shop cash payment ledger from 2006 is still a vehicle registration. The body of water preserves what it takes. The clay and the silt and the cold, close darkness of 9 meters doesn't destroy. It keeps. It keeps everything. What the Hargrove case had required was not new evidence. It had required the mechanism to find what was already there. The survey equipment. The infrastructure project. The federal funding that had been sought for years and had finally arrived in 2023. In another world, a world without that specific funding cycle, without that specific project scope, without the requirement for an underwater survey, the truck might have stayed at the bottom of Cotter's Lake indefinitely. The ground for the new construction might have been broken at a different location. The survey might not have covered the southern bank. Marcus Webb might never have moved his sonar instrument to the specific grid square at 9 meters depth where the reading came back wrong. Sandra thought about this. She thought about it in the specific way that investigators think about contingency, not as a consolation or a comfort, but as a fact about how cases close or don't close, and what the difference between those two outcomes depends on. It depends, often, on something that has nothing to do with the investigation itself. A road widening project that disturbs a buried vehicle. A database cross-reference that produces a name. A man at 70 who cannot carry the weight one more year. The cases that close are not necessarily the cases that had better evidence or better investigators. Sometimes they are simply the cases where the mechanism finally aligned with the thing that was already there. She also thought about Linda Hargrove's Saturdays. She thought about the 936 Saturdays, -9, over 18 years. She thought about the fact that Linda had been going to the lake all along, had been present at the site, had been within 100 meters of the truck on every first Saturday of September for 18 years. She had been close enough to the answer every time that the distance between them was measurable in meters. Linda hadn't known that. She hadn't been looking for the truck. She had been meeting her family. But she had been there. Sandra put a version of this observation in her final case summary in a paragraph that she revised 4 times before she was satisfied with it. She wrote, "The case resolution was facilitated by routine infrastructure survey work, subsequent forensic analysis, and the voluntary confession of the responsible party." It is also worth noting that the victim's spouse maintained an 18-year practice of visiting the lake site, which represents a form of sustained engagement with the case that, while it did not contribute directly to the resolution, speaks to the particular perseverance that sustained this investigation through its longest cold period and motivated its continued prioritization within department resources. She read it back. It was accurate. It was also insufficient. She kept it anyway, because insufficient accuracy was better than eloquent inexactness, and accuracy was what the report required. What the report didn't contain, what reports never contain, is the full texture of what it meant for a woman to drive 14 miles every Saturday morning for 18 years and sit in a car and look at a lake, not knowing that 80 meters from where she parked, under 9 meters of dark water and 18 years of silt, the answer was already there. Already waiting. 14 miles from home the whole time. There is something specific about the experience of being in Clover Ridge in the fall of 2020 for that the people who were there describe in similar terms when you ask them. What they describe is not the sensation of a mystery solved. It's something quieter than that. More like the feeling of a held breath finally released, not a gasp, not a relief, but the simple end of a tension that had been present so long that the town had forgotten it was there until it eased. People went about their days. The schools opened for the fall semester. The farmers' market ran through October the way it always did. The high school football team won 4 games and lost 4, which was about what people expected. The cross-country team had a strong season, their best in 3 years. And when the results were read at the season-end gathering and the coach listed the runners' times in sequence, he paused before the last name on the list and said, "Locker 145. He didn't explain the pause. The team understood. Ray Okafor came back to Clover Ridge 3 times between April and December 2024. He came for the recovery. He came for the funeral. He came in November for no specific reason, except that he needed to be in the town for a while and see it with his own eyes, see how it held what had happened to it and what it had finally received. He drove out to the lake on his last day of that visit. He sat in the parking area above the southern bank for 20 minutes. He had brought coffee. He thought about Thomas Hargrove in the specific way he had been thinking about Thomas Hargrove for 26 years, not with grief exactly, not with guilt exactly, though both of those were in it, but with the full complicated weight of a long connection to another person's story that had become, in some ways, inseparable from his own. He thought about the morning of September 8, 2006, when he had sat at the kitchen table in the yellow house on Maple Creek Road and looked at Linda Hargrove's face and asked the questions that the job required him to ask. And she had answered every one with a steadiness that he had recognized, even then, as courage. He thought about 12 years of the file on his desk. He thought about the photograph on his mantelpiece. He thought about the call on April 14th, Sandra's voice reading the plate number, and the way he had said it back to her, and the way it had felt when he did. He drank his coffee. He watched the lake. Then he drove home to Findlay, to Deborah, to the house where Thomas Hargrove's photograph had lived on the mantelpiece for 6 years. He took the photograph down when he got home. He put it in the frame he'd bought for it at a shop on Route 30, a simple wooden frame that he'd been meaning to use for 3 years and hadn't gotten around to. He hung it in the hallway. It's there now, in the Okafor house on Birchwood Drive in Findlay, Ohio. Thomas Hargrove's patient face in a wooden frame in a hallway, where people pass it when they come and go, where it is part of the ordinary traffic of a home, where it is, at last, in the right kind of place. Linda Hargrove turned 70 in April of 2025. Her birthday is April 14th. She and Ray Okafor have the same birthday. They discovered this in 10th grade chemistry, the year they sat behind each other, and it had been the beginning of an acquaintance that eventually became something else, the long friendship of people who have been through the same storm from different angles. On her 70th birthday, The first anniversary of the date Marcus Webb had called 911 from a boat in the middle of Cotter's Lake. Linda's family came to the house on Maple Creek Road. Jessica and Andrew and Rachel and Tommy. Ray and Deborah drove up from Findlay. Barbara Eastwood came with her husband. Neighbors came. Former students of Thomas's who were now in their 40s came. The yellow house filled up. Tommy sat at the kitchen table at some point in the evening and asked his grandmother if he could see the fish log before it was buried with Danny. Linda looked at him. She said the fish log was with Danny. Tommy thought about this. He said, "That's okay. I'll make my own." He already had 3 entries. 38 to go. Linda put her hand on the side of his face and didn't say anything, and he let her, in the way that 10-year-olds will sometimes allow a grandmother to do something like that when they understand, without the words for it, that it matters. The house was full of people. The kitchen smelled like the food people bring when they want to show up in a form that can be eaten. Someone had put music on in the living room, something low and pleasant. Through the kitchen window, the April evening was going golden over the maple tree in the backyard, the tree where the squirrel had been doing something unnecessary on the morning of September 6, 2006, while Linda stood with her coffee and thought about how good everything was. The tree was bigger now. The light through it was the same. The thing about a story like this one, the thing that stays with you after you've sat with it for a while, is not the crime. The crime is terrible and it is real and it is at the center of everything, but it is not the thing that stays. What stays is the arithmetic of the ordinary, the note under the lamp, the oatmeal, the wave at the window, the 7 words, "Gone fishing, back by noon," the sticky note with the handwriting on it, written in the quiet consideration of a man who didn't want to wake his wife, who left the note where she'd see it, who tucked it under the base of her lamp where it wouldn't blow away when she opened the back door. That's the detail that contains the whole man. That's the detail that tells you everything about who Thomas Hargrove was, not the biography, not the resume of his kindnesses, not the testimonials, but the specific, unremarkable, habitual consideration of leaving a note in the right place so she'd find it without looking. That is who he was. That is what was lost. And the fish log. The fish log with its 41 entries and its hand-drawn diagrams and its weather comparison data in the back section. 3 complete. 38 to go. The fish log is not a metaphor. Danny Hargrove was not a metaphor. He was a 14-year-old kid with a system for approaching the world and a belief, as fundamental as breath, as unexamined, that he had time. That there were 38 more entries to make. That the fish were out there. That the Saturdays were going to keep coming. They were going to keep coming. They were supposed to keep coming. That is the specific shape of what September 6th, 2006 took from the world. Not only a father and a son. The shape of an ordinary morning expanded outward into all the ordinary mornings it was supposed to become. We tell these stories because the shape deserves to be spoken. Because Thomas and Danny Hargrove were not abstractions, and were not symbols, and were not cautionary tales. They were a man who fixed things and a boy who made lists, and they were on their way to a lake they loved. And what happened to them happened because of one man's cowardice and 18 years of chosen silence, and the particular tragedy of truth that surfaces too late to undo the damage, but not too late to name it clearly and keep it from disappearing again. We keep saying the names. Thomas Hargrove. Daniel Hargrove. We keep saying them because that's the least we owe. Thank you for watching Ultimate Crime Stories. If this story moved you, if it made you sit differently with the people you love, if it reminded you that showing up is never a small thing, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and stay with us, because every week on Ultimate Crime Stories, we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories of truth buried and truth found. Stories of the people who kept looking. Stories that deserve to be told with the full weight of what they carry. We research deeply, we tell honestly, we do not look away from the difficult parts, because the people in these stories never got to look away, and the least we can do is show up for their stories the way they showed up for each other. Subscribe. Share this video. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. We read them all. We will see you next week on Ultimate Crime Stories. Until then, hold your people close. Tell them where you're going, and come home.